Welcome to another edition of Danny's Hot Takes. Today we're going to be reviewing the Warhammer 40,000 9th edition rule set. And specifically, we're going to be talking about terrain features. So terrain is kind of the way that you is the third player in a game that you're playing. Well, maybe the fourth player. I don't know. The mission might be the third player. There's a lot of people playing 40K all at the same time. So
it's a stage show.
It is.
A menagerie.
It's basically vaudeville. So this section provides rules for using a range of terrain features that can transform your gaming table into an interactive, thematic battlefield set in the 41st millennium. These rules help to bring your battlefield to life and introduce a new tactical dimension to your games. So terrain is really important because it blocks line of sight to things. It allows you to interact with the game in a different way. It gives cool abilities if you want to in thematic things, like if you want to defend a temple or something like that. It really kind of brings the game to life other than just rolling dice at each other and moving models. So terrain categories, terrain falls into one of four different categories. You've got hills, you've got obstacles, you've got area terrain, and you've got buildings. Some models can gain the benefit of cover from terrain features, and we'll talk about cover a little bit later. So the first of these different terrain categories we have are hills. So hills are basically just like you would imagine a hill to be. If you can't imagine what a hill to be, imagine a big lump in the ground. Hills are.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
You're welcome. I got you.
$97, please.
Hills are considered to be part of the battlefield rather than a terrain feature. Models can move over hills using normal rules for movement. Models can use normal rules to determine if a model is behind a hill is visible, and hills can't be attacked. You can't blow up a hill. I beg to differ. I can definitely blow up a hill. Hills are kind of thematic. Hills are really nice terrain in that they don't have a lot of rules associated with them, and they let you kind of hide models behind them a lot of times. All right, then we have obstacles. Obstacles are things like barricades, walls, kind of broken down pieces of ruin, a bunch of barrels in a line, things that your guys can hide behind. An infantry, beast, or swarm model receives the benefits of cover from an obstacle while it's within 3 inches of that terrain feature, unless when you resolve that attack targets them. When you resolve an attack that targets that model's unit, you can draw a line of sight 1 millimeter in thickness to every part of that model's base from a single point on the attacking model's base, without any of those lines passing over or through any part of that terrain feature. So basically, as long as you're kind of behind that that piece of terrain, and they're not able to, and you're partially shielded at least from every part of that model's hull or base, you're going to get the benefit of cover. Of course, cover is a +1 bonus to your save. There are some models that do get to ignore that, but usually that is mostly what the benefit of cover is. There is also specific types of cover, which we'll go over in the advanced terrain rules after this. And again, you're only going to benefit from that if you have the keyword infantry, beast, or swarm, and you have to be within 3 inches of that piece of terrain. Area terrain is probably one of the most general types of terrain and probably one of the most common types of terrain, along with buildings. So area terrain is a piece of terrain that has a footprint. So it has a definable border that you know exactly where that piece of terrain starts and ends. It has models can move over area terrain just like normal movement, no big deal. Like you can't move through a tree, obviously, or anything like that, unless that has a specific keyword, which it might. Models can use normal rules to determine whether or not you can draw line of sight to them. And if an infantry, beast, or swarm model is on the terrain, as long as they're within it, so they don't have to be wholly within, they just have to be within it, they'll get the benefit of cover. And then finally, you can't attack area terrain. That's important too. Then finally, we have buildings. Buildings are considered to be buildings are considered to be units and not really terrain features. Models you can't move through a building. And models use normal rules to determine if it's blocks line of sight and things like that. And if it's an enemy building, you are able to attack it. which is an important part of the building rules. So typically buildings are going to be things like fortifications or solid non-attack buildings. So area terrain is probably the most common piece of terrain in the game, whereas buildings are a little bit less common. Obstacles are also fairly common, but we'll go into specific examples of all of those. So then we have a list of what traits terrain has. So each terrain feature will have a certain number of traits assigned to it. And after this, we'll go over some of kind of what the more common terrain features are. They have some really great examples in the next couple of pages of what they recommend each piece of terrain, like what kind of traits they would imagine that piece of terrain would have. So defensible terrain is terrain that your infantry can kind of, obviously they can defend while they're on it. If every model from an infantry unit is on or within a piece of area terrain that has this trait, it can either hold steady or set to defend when an enemy unit declares a charge against it. If they decide to hold steady, they'll get to Overwatch on a 5+, whereas if they decide to set to defend, they'll get a +1 to hit in melee, which is really good. Both of those are very good abilities. So this is a piece of terrain that you can kind of set a guy in the doorway and kind of funnel the enemy in and really let him have it. Then you have defense lines. So defense lines, if an enemy unit is within 1 inch of this terrain feature, it can still make a charge move against it, so long as the charging unit ends its charge move touching the terrain feature and within 2 inches of the target unit. So this kind of extends melee range for units, so you can kind of engage them a little bit better. But they don't count as being in engagement range. You just get to fight with them. So just keep that in mind. Like, they can still shoot you back even if they can still fight you. So this kind of ends in a weird kind of scenario where they can kind of shoot you and fight. The enemy can shoot you and fight you. So just be aware of that if you're attacking somebody in a defense line. You haven't locked them into combat until you've moved over the piece of terrain and are actually within engagement range. Then you have reachable terrain. Infantry, beasts, and swarms can move through the walls, girders, change, and foliage of this terrain feature without impediment. So that's really nice. You can move through, like, for instance, I know ruins have this particular rule. You can move through the walls if you have one of these keywords. So infantry, beast, or swarm get a little bit more options for moving. If you're a vehicle or a monster, you're going to have to walk around that wall, whereas infantry can kind of scurry away from you by hiding within it. Difficult ground. If a unit makes a normal move, advances, falls back, or makes a charge move, and any of its models move over any part of this terrain, subtract 2 from the maximum distance every model in that unit can move to a minimum of 0. So it could be if you have a random movement value or a super low movement value, and you try and move over difficult terrain, you won't be able to move. And this has to be if every part of the terrain feature is, even if every part of the terrain feature is less than 1 inch in height. So it ignores that standard rule where you get to move over those pieces of terrain without penalty. This penalty does not apply if every model in the unit has the fly keyword. Dense cover. So dense cover has quite a bit of rules here. The gist of dense cover is if you're within 3 inches of it and somebody is drawing line of sight to you, if every single model in your unit can't be drawn line of sight to without that 1 inch or that 1 millimeter line crossing over the piece of terrain, you're going to get a -1 to hit. The exception to this rule is if aircraft are shooting, if the unit is on the terrain, then they ignore that penalty. Or if something is being shot that has a wounds characteristic of 18 or more, so something that's really big and tough, you can shoot them no problem. Unstable position. Models cannot be set up or move on top of this terrain feature. They can't end a move on top of it. So basically, like, this is like tank traps or something like that, where like the models can't end their move on top of it, but they can move over it. So just, you can't end on top. So just be aware of that when you're moving. Exposed position. So models on top of this terrain feature don't get the benefit of cover, even if that piece of terrain will give them cover. So this is important in that, like, for instance, I know shipping containers have this. So if you're on top of a shipping container, obviously you're probably not getting cover. But if you're off to the side of it and you're using it to kind of block a little bit of line of sight, you can still get cover from that shipping container. Obscuring terrain. So obscuring terrain is one of the most powerful terrain features in the entire game. And what this does is the terrain feature has to be at least 5 inches in height. Models won't be able to see through this terrain to other models unless the model that they're trying to draw line of sight to is an aircraft or a model with a wounds characteristic of 18 or more. Models within obscuring terrain don't count for that. So you can see and shoot at those normally. But otherwise, models that are behind the terrain, you won't be able to see or shoot at with impunity. They're kind of protected from the density of that terrain. Not to be confused with dense cover. Then we have light cover. Light cover will add 1 to the saving throw bonus if you get the benefit of cover. So this is kind of what that standard benefit of cover is. Most cover is light cover. And then we have heavy cover. So heavy cover protects you against melee attacks. So in melee, and again, in light cover won't affect invulnerable saves. I should say that as well. Same with heavy cover. So heavy cover will give you a +1 to your save in close combat if you're fighting, unless you've made a charge move. If you've made a charge move, you're exposed and people are better able to fight you. But if you haven't made a charge move, then you won't get a benefit to your armor save, or to your save characteristic, I should say. Scalable. So scalable lets you climb up different levels so you can move on top of the terrain. And of course, you'll pay normal movement penalties for moving up. Like you have to actually move your models. Like if a piece of terrain is 5 inches high, it's going to take 5 inches of your movement value to get up to the next level if you're directly underneath it. And only infantry, beast, or swarm models will be able to do that. Note that fly models will be able to do that no problem because they ignore vertical distance when they move, and they also have a special caveat in here that they can do that they can move on top no problem. And then finally we have inspiring. Add 1 to the leadership value of any units while they're wholly within 6 inches of this terrain feature. So some terrain features will have inspiring for a certain faction, and so only models from that faction will gain that inspiring keyword. And so the next section we have here is our common terrain feature. So this kind of goes over some common ones here. So the first one we have is ruins. So ruins are area terrain. So while you're inside of them, you'll get cover. And they have the scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible, and obscuring. So scalable being, of course, that you can move on top of it. Whereas the breachable means you can move through the walls. Light cover means that you'll get a +1 bonus to your save from shooting attacks while you're within it or on it. And defensible means that you can choose whether or not you want to hold the line, or prepare positions. Sorry, was it? Oh yeah, hold steady or set to defend. You can choose which one of those you want to do while you're inside of it if you get charged. And obscuring means that it blocks line of sight, probably the most important one. So you won't be able to draw line of sight through this terrain if your units are behind this, or if the enemy units are behind this, also important. Then we have craters. Craters are also area terrain. They have the light cover rule and difficult ground, so they're a -2 to movement if you try and move through it. So these can be very tactical. You can kind of use those to your best advantage to make sure that like your enemy units are slowed when they try and charge them or try and move through them. Then we have armored containers. And of course they're light cover, so if you're on them, you're going to get a benefit to cover if you're infantry. Armored containers are obstacles. So again, you can kind of fight over those, and they have the light cover scalable, so you can move over them. And exposed position, meaning that while you're on them, you won't get any cover save, just kind of like what we talked about. Barricades and fuel type are also obstacles. They have the defense line, light cover, heavy cover, defensible, unstable position, and difficult ground. So you can't end your move on top of them, and you're going to take movement penalties for moving over them, even if they're short. And you can get light cover and heavy cover if you're close to them. So you can get that cover save as long as you're infantry, beasts, or swarms, and you're close to them. So those ones have a lot of rules and very interesting. You can do a lot of stuff with those. Then you have woods. Woods are area terrain. They have the dense cover, breachable, defensible, and difficult ground. Breachable means that you can move through the foliage, so you can move through woods, through trees and stuff like that as you're moving through. They have dense cover, so they're a -1 penalty to hit if you shoot through the woods, and they're also difficult ground, so you'll spend movement. There will be a movement penalty for moving through the woods. Battlefield debris, so these are obstacles, and they just have the exposed position rules. So they basically don't do anything at all. And then you have industrial structure. So the industrial structure has the area terrain keyword, and it has scalable, breachable, so you can move up it or through it if you're infantry, beasts, or swarms. And it has the dense cover and defensible traits, so you can get that bonus if you get charged and things like that. The Imperial Statuary is light cover, unstable position, so you can't climb on top of it or end your move on top of him. Although it would be cool to kind of sit on top of that spear and shoot somebody. And it also has inspiring to Imperium units, so they get a +1 leadership if they're wholly within 6 inches. And then finally we have ruined walls, which are also obstacles, and they're a defense line. They're reachable, so you can move through them. They're dense cover, defensible, and an unstable position, so you can't end on top of the wall. But otherwise, you can kind of move through them if you're infantry, beasts, or swarms. They're the dense cover, so there'll be a -1 penalty to hit if you shoot through them. And the defensible ones means you get a couple of options if somebody charges you. So that goes over the terrain rules. We also have some example battlefields as we go through here. So this kind of details how many pieces of terrain should end up on the table, and some examples of really cool looking battles, and maybe what is fun to do, and then maybe what's more kind of fair for both people to play against. So some great examples there to show you kind of how best to set up a table, so that you have some line of sight blocking terrain in the middle, so you can kind of hide your army and not everything will just die to turn one shooting, which is important. All right, so that concludes our review of terrain.